about it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's official. It's been recorded. Okay, well, so I'll be giving you this tutorial, which I believe is the first seminar in a series of seminars of this interest group in the MICCAI. Lei has already introduced me, so I'll just get started straight away. So okay, hold on. No, cool. I'm gonna minimize this so you can see my entire screen, okay? So Lei, if there are questions, you will have to interrupt me because now I don't see anyone. Okay, so let's start with some history. So, just to make it clear, this is a tutorial in which I will be walking you through like a series of steps on how to design digital twins in healthcare with a specific focus on cardiology. Okay, so first let's start with an example from past history. And the furthest back that I could go and I could find an example of a digital twin was this one, was the Apollo 13 mission, right? So at the time of the Apollo 13 mission, at NASA, they were using simulators to train the crew and to prepare them for adverse situations in space, and also to prepare them for like how to operate and which tools for them to know which tools they had at their disposal to solve problems that could arise during the mission. So here you have on the left-hand side a picture of the crew in the training module, so inside the simulator. On the right-hand side, you can see the simulators from the outside. So this is like the equipment that the space crew were using for the training exercises. And I have put here a quote from the NASA chief flight director for this mission at that time, which says, the simulators were some of the most complex technology of the entire space program, right? So just to give you a sense of how much complexity and how much work had gone into it. And I mean, it just shows that if they had already simulators that could like simulate the entire like mission, like they were very ahead of their time, like at NASA. And you have here a link if you want to look at the place where I got all these materials from for the Apollo 13 mission. It's quite cool. They have also not video, like audio recordings of what the astronauts were saying during the mission, which is quite neat. So I encourage you to check it out if you want. Okay, so they have these virtual models because of course these are actually virtual models because they have all the mathematical equations inside. So they have the simulation side. What is different from what we see when we use like simulators for modeling the human heart is the interface. So we use a laptop or a desktop, and in their case, they had this very bulky, like, and very big, like, interface, right? Like that was an actual replica of the inside of the spacecraft. But the simulator is the same. So in this sense, we have a really strong correspondence. So they had the simulator for the Apollo 13 mission, but why do we call it a digital twin? Was it new for this mission? And the answer is no, it wasn't new. It had already been used in previous missions. Maybe now it was more sophisticated, but it was definitely not something that was completely new. So what made this the first instance of a digital twin that we can agree on is what happened during the mission. So during the mission, there was an incident. So there was an oxygen tank explosion in the spacecraft, which damaged the spacecraft severely and damaged also the engine, right? So this meant that the asset, and I use the word asset because it's quite often used when we talk about digital twins. So the spacecraft, when it left Earth, they knew the state of the spacecraft, but now in space, it had changed its state. So it was, as you can understand, it's a different spacecraft, right? And they didn't have a model for it. So now it's when we're going to see why this becomes a digital twin, right? So the story plays like this. So the explosion went off, the astronauts were inside, and they heard the noise, everything trembled, and then is when they communicated to mission control the famous sentence of, "Houston, we've had a problem," right? That's where the quote comes from. And then mission control were getting, like, from the astronauts all these readings from the sensors that they were so abnormal that they were sure this was an instrumentation error, that it wasn't possible that something so big had happened that had changed so much, like all the readings that they were getting. But through communication with the astronauts, they were able to quickly analyze and infer that actually something really bad had happened, right? And they were able to even determine that what had happened is that the oxygen tank had exploded, which led to a series of like decisions that they had to take to save the astronauts, right? One of those was to move the astronauts from one part of the spacecraft to another one so that their oxygen supplies would not run out and they wouldn't die asphyxiated, right? So, however, there was still a big question remaining. Okay, the astronauts are still alive, but the spacecraft is off course and it's never going to make it back. So the astronauts are going to die. So how do we get the spacecraft back on course? That was the question that they wanted to answer. And they didn't know how to make the calculations for the spacecraft because it had been damaged. So they didn't know what was its state. They didn't know how to adjust its current trajectory. So they were asking the astronauts to make a lot of tests, and they were accumulating a lot of data. But it happens a lot to all of us, right? So we get a lot of data for a specific problem, but then we wonder, okay, I have a lot of data, but how do I use it? How do I use this? How do I transform this data into an answer to the question that I have, which is how to correct the trajectory of the spacecraft in this case, right? It would be, sorry, someone said something? No. Okay. It would be easier if we actually did know like how the spacecraft was at that time, right? Because then we could make some calculations. So then is when Mission Control had the idea to set up this this diagram, like this working diagram or protocol in place, right? So they were communicating with the astronauts. The astronauts were getting indirect measurements and observations of the spacecraft from the inside. And then Mission Control asked the backup crew to go into the simulator and continuously adapt the simulator that was usually being used only for forward planning, right? To adjust it until all the measurements that they were getting in the sensors of the simulator would match the ones from the astronauts, and until they were able to perturb the spacecraft in space and the simulator in the same way, and they were able to get the same response. So this was essentially a personalization exercise, right? They were an inference exercise. They were inferring the parameters of the spacecraft in space using the simulator and using continuous observations.
Sorry, Julia, it seems that someone is on mute or not on mute. May I ask every audience, please mute yourself to, in case interrupt Julia's presentation. Okay, please go ahead. Sorry, I forgot to mention.
Thank you, Lei. No worries. Okay, so through this workflow and this protocol, they were actually able to correctly identify like the state of the spacecraft, make their calculations, and they were able to inform the astronauts on how to perform the maneuvers manually to come back to Earth safely. And this is a diagram of the journey that they did, right? So in red, I have highlighted the time and well, the moment in which the oxygen tank exploded. And in green, I have highlighted for you the 3 different corrections that they had to do to get the spacecraft back on track and for them to be able to return back to Earth. Okay, so what does this make? Why is this then a digital twin, right? What did it make this instance different than previous ones? And the fact is that there is just no possible doubt that this was a digital twin, because it had all the different aspects that a digital twin will have. So it had a physical asset, it had a virtual model, it had real-time data simulation, and it was being used for decision-making in a way that it altered the state of the physical asset, and then the virtual environment had to be re-updated. So there was a continuous connection between the physical asset and the virtual environment that was unique to this physical asset because it had been damaged. So it was not a generic connection, right? So Yeah. So now what we want to know is, okay, we have seen an example of a digital twin, but are all digital twins the same? Is this like the only definition we can get? And the answer is, of course, not. So the definition of a digital twin will strongly depend on the context of use in which a digital twin is actually going to be used at and for, right? So there will be cases in which you will have a digital twin that needs to be updating itself in real time. And there will be cases in which it can be done offline, because maybe you're updating based on clinical measurements of a patient that only comes once per week into the clinic. On the other hand, maybe you do have like a smartwatch that is taking like continuous measurements, and then you can have an online real-time continuous update. Like depending on the application and like the context of use and the question you want to answer, a digital twin will be different, right? So here are a few words in different boxes that defined more or less give you like a bit of a broad definition of what a digital twin can be. So it will be like computer-based, digital, dynamic model or representation of a physical asset or environment that behaves identically, interfaces with data, and at multiple scales, and it's used to make decisions of the physical asset, right? And now what we're going to see is how to design them. But first, we need to think about why would we even want digital twins in cardiology? So there's a very strong difference here between the case that they were seeing at NASA and when we think about cardiology. And the fact is that the patients are not in space. So patients are here, they are in the clinic, the doctor is seeing them. So it's not the same context of use at all, because we don't have an indirect observation of someone that is not there, and we're trying to infer how this person looks like or something like that. But the fact remains that while it looks like our context of use is very different, right, and our reality is very different than the one that they were having at NASA, it's more similar than we think at the same time. Because despite that the patient is right in front of us and we can see them and we can take measurements of them, right, the fact is they are still really unknown to us. So for example, here you have an example of a current clinical problem, which is that 40% of dilated cardiomyopathy patients relapse into heart failure after drug withdrawal. So the clinical guideline is to keep medication in all patients, right? Which means that 60% of patients would not need to continue taking this medication. They are still given the medication because we are unable to understand the differences or to see beyond, like to see inside of the patient which ones they would need the medication or not, right? So the idea is that maybe digital twins can help us bridge this gap. They can help us distinguish better like between patients, understand better their physiology, and understand better which ones actually need the medications and which ones don't. Which interestingly starts to highlight that we have very strong differences with aerospace. So we do have commonalities, as we were saying. So in our space, you have also multi-scale models, as you can see in this diagram, which is taken from a paper from Steve Niederer. By the way, you will see some annotations in some of the slides, which give credit to people I have adapted slides from. They are usually on the top left corner of the slide. So in terms of similarities, they are multi-scale, and also they involve various physical disciplines. In terms of differences, however, the biggest difference is that we do design the airplane or the spacecraft. So on its original configuration, we really understand its behavior and we can make very accurate predictions for those assets. This changes when the asset gets damaged, but we get back the really strong and very accurate predictions once we're able to correctly identify the damage that has occurred, right? In cardiology, it's not like that. In cardiology, we have huge unknowns to the extent in which we cannot tell who needs and who doesn't need a medication in the same disease, despite that we can take lots of measurements of those people, right? And there will be lots of processes underlying cardiac physiology that we still don't understand. For example, how it actually links with the nervous system, how hormonal levels like might affect cardiac behavior, or how genetics play a role like in which cases genetics are playing a role in the development of the heart and in which ways, right? Like in terms, especially in terms of like abnormalities that are still like poorly understood. So all of this, right, like will come into like limitations and different expectations that we can have in terms of this, like designing digital twins for cardiology compared to aerospace, right? It's something that is important to keep in mind. But having said that, now let's just go straight into cardiology. Let's leave behind the aerospace field and keep it just an introduction. And from now on, we will just stick with cardiology, right? So this is a diagram of what I like to think about when I imagine a digital twin in cardiology. So we have a patient, we get measurements from the patient, we get clinical data. We use this to build a model that is used then to make decisions about, for example, therapy or diagnosis, which then is used to actually impact the real patient. So the real patient gets like decisions or gets like treatments that come from decisions that have been made using the digital twin, possibly as well as other strategies, but complementary at least, right? And then this just closes the loop. And then maybe we can use the information from the digital twin to create some sort of database so that we can make it more efficient and not have to calculate digital twins every single time, so that it's more scalable and sustainable, right? And we can make better long-term prognosis predictions as well. Cool. So having seen what a generic digital twin in cardiology would look like, we now need to look at how do we actually design one. And as we said before, it will depend on several things. The first one being the context of use. So here I have broken down a series of steps, like in terms of like incremental decisions that I have designed here so that to split the digital twinning design workflow. Okay, so if you have a different problem that you want to apply digital twins for, like in cardiology or in healthcare, or maybe it could also be used for other disciplines, but let's keep it for now, at least in healthcare. Like if you go through these different steps, you are much likelier to end up with a successful deployment and a successful design of a digital twin, right? So let's go through them. So the first one would be, what is the context of use? Because this will definitely define and impact like what kind of like digital twin I get in the end. Good. So I have here listed a few different contexts of use that you can think about in the context of cardiology. For example, it could be knowledge discovery. So this would relate back to the case of having 40% of patients requiring a medication and another 60% don't. Maybe we want to understand better the patients that do require the medication. So we want to dig deeper into their physiology. So we want to discover new mechanisms, for example. This could be a knowledge discovery case. It could also be therapy guidance. So it could be, for example, you want to guide a clinical procedure, for example, an ablation process. So you want to know where to burn, and once you have burned, you want to update your digital twin and decide whether you need to burn somewhere else or not, or what should you do next. It could also be patient management, like calibrating a specific drug, like calibrating drug dosage, like across time, with considering like recovery of certain disease or condition, how you continue adjusting or you change medication. Or it could also be something in the lines of like virtual clinical trials, right? So we have some new drug that we want to know if it's going to be safe and efficient to treat a specific disease in a specific context, right? Because we're going through this tutorial, I will continue as we see different choices. I will continue narrowing it down so we stick in a specific example rather than keeping it broad all the time. So, and I have chosen to go for virtual clinical trials because overall from these different choices, I mean, the first one, knowledge discovery, is a very straightforward one that can actually be done already, and it has been done extensively. But maybe it is also the less risky one. So then from the rest, virtual clinical trial is the one that I think digital twins in cardiology are most ready for. So there's still lots of checks and validations and tests that need to happen for them to be applied in the other cases. When there's a real patient behind, you're impacting the life of a real person directly, right? Although I will say that some groups are already going and already starting to use digital twins for therapy guidance, specifically, I think, in the context of ablation, and they have my greatest respect for that, because I know it's a very challenging problem to tackle. Yeah, and I think they do very well on advancing science in that direction. Well, but we will stick with virtual clinical trials, which is a bit of a safer option for now. Okay, to continue narrowing it down into specific context of use, let's look at a specific disease. So let's say post-myocardial infarction. So heart attack survivors, we know that they have like tissue heterogeneities in the heart, tissue conduction heterogeneities in the heart, which can lead to deadly arrhythmias. So what we want to do now is we're just making pretend here, because this is a drug that is well understood and is well studied, but let's just pretend it's not. Let's just pretend this is a new drug that we don't know, like we know its effects at ionic level, and we understand the composition of the drug, but it has not been tested yet. So we want to know if it's going to be safe or not, and if it's going to be effective or not in stopping myocardial infarction patients from developing arrhythmias. So we know that across the population, people will develop differently and will heal differently from myocardial infarction. So they will have different scar extents, they will have different severities. They also will have like intrinsic different properties in the heart. Like their hearts will already be different from the get-go, and they would have already responded differently to the therapy without the disease. But with the disease, the dispersion and the variability increases further, right? So you have this huge variability, right, in terms of like disease therapy response and disease development. So then what we want to do is we want to use modeling and simulation to represent this variability and to be able to test and evaluate the therapy's efficacy and safety. So the next thing we need to think about once we have pinned down the context of use is what data do we have available? So for this case, because we are assuming in this fictitious context of use, which has real words, but again, we're using a therapy that is already been tested. So we are still like, it's a bit, it's a pseudo-fictitious context of use, if you want. Okay? We are assuming we don't have data for how people respond to this therapy. So that's why the data is not here. But what we do have is we have a lot of data of people's hearts, right? So we can actually capture part of what we were saying here, the individual variation in terms of anatomical and function. So that we can represent, because we have people's MRIs and we have people's ECGs. So from the MRIs, we can capture like anatomical variabilities, and from the ECGs, we can capture functional variabilities. And with this, we should be able to create a cohort of virtual subjects in a similar way that they will be collected for a clinical trial, right? Because they will be like different between them, and they will represent the specific like distribution of people. Okay, so that is our refined objective now. So we have this big data and we have the modeling and simulation. And now what we want is to build digital twins to, in this case, decide whether this therapy is effective for post-myocardial infarction or not. So just to recapitulate, then what are the features that the digital twin should have once we have designed it, like at the end? So it needs to be able to assimilate the data that we have, and in order to represent the variability in a successful way that we want to have in the virtual cohort, because otherwise, so we want this virtual cohort to be representative, we want it to be physiological, and we want it, you know, to have all these like realistic properties that we would have if we were using real people collected at random. We also need to be able to represent the characteristics of the disease, of course, because that's part of our context of use, and we need to be able to predict unseen drug effects in specific for the fetalite, because we have decided that, well, we have established that there is no previous data for this drug. So then the next question that we need to ask ourselves is, what do we already know? And I'm not talking about if we already know the answer to the question we're asking. We're assuming that everything up to here has been done like correctly, and there is no data for any of these things, or there is for the ones we said. So it's, what do we know that could help us in designing this digital twin? Like, we don't want to omit any information that is already well established when designing a new digital twin, because then maybe we won't even get as good as state of the art if we start omitting data at this point. So something that we already know is, we know human cardiac electrophysiology. We know it quite well, which is strongly related to arrhythmias. So we know that how the heart works in terms of electrical activity, and we know that it produces an electrocardiogram, right? So we know that the electrocardiogram is a representation of the electrical activity. However, recovering the electrical activity from the electrocardiogram is still a challenge, and it's not a completely solved problem, right? So there's a non-uniqueness of solution, it's a nil-post problem, and it has lots of hurdles. And these problems are magnified when you actually use 12-lead ECG, which is the data that we have available in the UK Biobank for this case of study, right? So we're even going to have more unidentifiability, more non-uniqueness of solution, etc. So this is going to be a challenging process. So we can, but still, we shouldn't ignore the fact that the electrocardiogram does represent the electrical activity of the heart, right? So what else do we know? Because we know lots of things, right? So beyond that, we know that drug response can depend on circadian rhythm, on food intake, and also on hormonal levels. So we have a lot of different information available to us when it comes to specifically cardiology, right? That could be relevant to solve this problem. However, we also need to think about whether, like, how deep we are going to go when designing a digital twin. And we need to sometimes narrow down the context of use to something that is feasible. So if we do have either lots of data on how these things play out with respect to channel expression or to drug response for a specific drug, maybe we can still do something about it. Or if we can actually derive some parameters for the model based on some of these things. But for this, we would need to know if the patients actually, like, we would need to know the diet of the patients, and we would need to know how the diet affects like the model that we're going to be building. So we need to have a connection between the knowledge that we have in general with the specific problem that we're going to be trying to solve, right? So if we don't have these connections, either through big data, and then we can do statistics on it, or through mechanistic knowledge, it's going to be very hard to incorporate this information into our digital twin. If this information was to be absolutely critical for the success of the digital twin, and we don't have it, maybe the digital twin is the wrong approach, because then maybe we won't be able to answer the question that we are asking in a successful enough way using this. Maybe there is no way to do like a virtual clinical trial on this drug if one of these factors is very important and we just cannot incorporate it. Maybe we should first go and understand this factor first, and then come back and do the digital twin with it, right? But it's still important to consider them. And this brings us to the next point, which is, what is the model complexity, and what is the type of model that we actually are looking for in this specific case of study that we are like portraying, which, just to remind you, is deciding whether the fetalite or specific drug is going to be safe and efficient for preventing deadly arrhythmias in patients of a specific disease, in this case, myocardial infarction, right? And for this, we're using MRI and ECG to build a large cohort of digital twins where we will evaluate this therapy. So there are different types of models that we can be thinking about, right? And they will have all like advantages and disadvantages. It will depend on what is specifically the data we have, whether we can use one model or another, right? So for example, for a statistical model, if we are going to be predicting like the effect of a drug, we need to have some sort of data set that has predictions for that drug so that we can make correlations and we can make predictions on that. If we don't have evidence on how the heart responds to the drug, it's going to be very hard to build a statistical model. Maybe we can use a statistical model for some other part of the digital twin. Maybe we can personalize using a statistical model. But for that, we will need data as well, right? Like some sort of historic on how the parameters of the model or properties of the heart correlate with data. For a mechanistic, we need to understand the mechanisms and how they connect to the data. And for a hybrid, I mean, I think it's a combination of both, so we don't need to look into it much. But it's important to know that it doesn't need to be black or white. There can be parts of a model or a digital twin that work in a statistical way and other parts that work in a mechanistic way. So just to illustrate a little bit further, although I'm fully aware you all know the difference that I'm trying to make here, which is the difference between statistical methods and mechanistic ones, right? Or also a physics-based, if you prefer, models. But actually, the point that I'm trying to make with this slide is the opposite of what I'm illustrating. And the point I'm trying to make is that usually we come to the conclusion that there is this big separation between these two groups of models. But I have seen, and this is because this is a tutorial, okay, so it's a bit targeted also like to students. I have seen many students like get trapped into this conception that these two types of models are very different from each other without really realizing that all models come from data. So there is no possible like physics-based, it's impossible to derive a physics-based model without data. Like all observations and all rules and all laws come from observations, which are data, right? So in the end, both types of models come from data. They will have different advantages and disadvantages, but without data, neither of them would be possible, right? So it's about, the differences are more about the properties that each type of model has and how they come to exist. So how do you create them? Those are where most of the differences are, rather than the fact that one comes from data and the other one doesn't, which is I think it's sometimes like a misleading statement that we do. We say, oh, my model is data-driven. Well, all models are data-driven. Your model is not special. Like physics-based models are also data-driven, right? So then we can come to this kind of like rundown, like table of differences. There will be others, and some of you might disagree with some of the ones that I state, but I think most of you will agree that statistical models are really simple to build, and that's lots of the appeal comes from that, especially since the adoption of deep learning strategies. So yeah, because they are assumption-free feature extraction models, right? So they are capable of like extracting the features automatically for large sums of data and build a model very easily. It doesn't require expert knowledge, so of the problem that you're trying to solve. So, and they're highly flexible. Then in the cons, I have put for statistical models that they require big data, but this is not necessarily a con, because like we are seeing more and more that we actually do have the big data. It's no longer as big a limitation as it used to be 10 years ago. Like 10 years ago, you were like, oh, but for deep learning, I need big data. Where am I going to get it from? But it's not as big a problem anymore. Right now, unless you're looking at a very specific problem in medicine, which is usually the case, but still, like if you do have the biobank, for example, you have lots of data for lots of things. If you start pruning down, for sure, you will get into small data again very quickly, but we do have data at scale. So it's becoming more of a pro, like as time moves by. But the remaining con, which is definitely like a problem of statistical models, is that they have uncontrolled assumptions. So you don't require an expert to build a statistical model, but I would say it is really encouraged to have an expert to check the statistical model. whether it's sound or not with human physiology, especially when you're doing when you're using it for medicine. On the other hand, mechanistic models can use small data sets, like really small, like of just like a few samples, which is an advantage that statistical models don't have. They are designed by experts, which once that has happened already becomes an advantage because it means they are much more controlled, and they can incorporate lots of information from different sources, including physics laws. So because we know that the heart is affected by gravity as much as any other thing, right, on Earth, so and in anywhere. So we don't need to collect data for this. We don't need a big data set to tell us that physics laws affect the organs of the human body, right? We can incorporate this knowledge directly without having to collect data for it. The knowledge does come from data, but it's easier and it's a more natural way to incorporate them into mechanistic models. However, they are quite stiff usually, like mechanistic models, because they have gone through many iterations and they're very problem specific, so they can require like expertise to modify them. Having said this, like to even break more like the difference between statistical or mechanistic models, you can actually use mechanistic models to train statistical ones. Then your statistical model becomes an emulator, a surrogate of your mechanistic model, and it ends up learning all the physics laws and all the physics equations that you had put in the former one. So the model itself is not intrinsically different. It just does mathematical. It solves mathematical equations. Both of them do in a computer usually. So yeah, the differences come more from how the data got incorporated in the model in the first place than anywhere else, just to break more of the stigma. So then which model are we going to use for this specific use case? For this specific use case, we don't have data of the fetal eye. So we are a bit constrained on having to use a model that can actually predict the effect of the fetal eye without having seen it before. So it needs to be a mechanistic model, at least for part of the problem, right? So this means that we are going to be looking at something like this. So we will have the therapy effects, we'll have a multi-scale cardiac model that can incorporate the fetal eye effects at subcellular level, scale them to organ and then to body level. And then we have the patient data from the UK Biobank that we want to personalize to before we apply the therapy effects, so that we get this range of variability that we have in the human population. And we also want to be able to model like disease characteristics, so that the problem is targeting a specific, so that we are targeting the specific problem that we were asking ourselves about. So then the next thing that we need to think about is feasibility, right? Because we're talking about model complexity and model type. Depending on the model choice, we will start running into feasibility problems. And this will happen very quickly, especially if we go down the route that we are choosing, which is to use a mechanistic model. So state-of-the-art mechanistic models for cardiac electrophysiology would be the monodomain. And it will be completely unfeasible to build any sort of digital twins using a monodomain model, which is like a heat diffusion, at scale, right? It would even be complex to do it in 1 or 2 cases. It would require supercomputing resources, most likely for multiple days. But at scale, on 60K subjects, and to test virtual therapies, it will be completely unfeasible. It will be impossible. So then what we can think about is what other models could be used to at least build the digital twins, which is going to be the most simulation-intensive part of the job. Because to build a digital twin for a mechanistic model, usually you will have to run lots of simulations and test different parameter values, right? So then we want to see if there is a model that gives us a similar output as the monodomain, but it's much faster. And for that, we could use, for example, DHlab, which has been already tested. Like several groups have adopted it for this problem. So it won't come as a surprise to many of you to see DHlab used in this context. What might be a bit different that you might notice here is that this is not the standard formulation of the DHlab. Well, the formulation, yes, but then here in the diagram in the bottom, it's not. So the iconal is a propagation model. So it defines the time at which a wavefront reaches different points in space. But here we are interpreting the geometry as a graph. And by interpreting the geometry as a graph, we can constrain the propagation to only happen along edges of this graph. And then it becomes some sort of Dijkstra algorithm. It's a simplification that you can do to the iconal, and it makes it even faster without losing too much accuracy in the prediction. And that's what was presented in this study by Michael Wallman. So now that we have decided to move from the monodomain to the iconal, I mean, we haven't fully decided yet. I mean, this would be the slide that is the tiebreaker and makes the decision for us, is when we look at the performance and we look at the pros and cons, right? So the iconal will be suitable for doing that personalization because it behaves like really similarly or virtually identically to the monodomain for the parameters that we are interested in for a model, which we haven't described yet, but let's say for the properties of our model that we are interested in, which would be how this wave propagates to the heart. So both models behave very similarly, as we saw here in this figure, right? Where you can see the monodomain in the first one, the second column here in this picture on the right-hand side of the slide is the traditional iconal formulation, and the third column is the iconal formulation with the Dijkstra simplification, so interpreting the geometry as a graph. And you can see that they are quite equivalent, all three. They're similar enough for us, right? But while still being similar, what you can see in this table is that the monodomain using high-performance computing will take 1 hour for 100 milliseconds of simulation, whereas the iconal takes less than 2 seconds in a desktop computer. It only needs 1 virtual CPU for this. So, yeah. So with this simplification on the model, we can bring back our digital twin adventure into a feasible kind of like range in which we will have resources to run this, and it will be feasible for either pharmaceutical companies or whoever is going to be doing these experiments to do them. So now that we have pinned down all the different properties and all the different aspects that we want our digital twin to have, it has come the time to actually generate the digital twins themselves. So I'm going to separate this in 2 parts, but I'm only going to focus on the latter, but I will briefly explain the former. So the first step would be the anatomical personalization, right? So for this, we want to take the DMR slices, we segment them, we stack them, we adjust the contours, and we do corrections so that the geometry remains physiological. For this, we can use a statistical chip model, for example, or just some mathematical rules to regularize. And then we can build the 3D geometry of the ventricles of the subject, which is where the arrhythmias take place that we're interested in. The arrhythmias that we're interested in take place, and where the ECG comes from, right? It's from the ventricles, at least most of the ECG. Okay, so this problem, right? And you can find here the publication for this. This problem is quite neat because you do have 2D data to represent the 3D geometry, but in reality you do have 3D data because you stack the MR slices in space and you know where they go. So with this, you have a 3D to 3D correspondence, which makes this problem like very nice problem to work on, right? With very nice properties. This is not the case when you look at the ECG. So the ECG also comes from a 3D phenomena. So it's the 3D electrical activity in the heart, but you only get a one-dimensional signal, like over time. So, well, you get multiple, but you get them like they're 1D and you only get 8 of them. So it's going to be extremely challenging to recover the cardiac electrical function from such a scarce and kind of like compressed together data modality, because it has lost its like 3D-ness already, and it's going to be a very summarized, if you want, like source of data of electrical activity, which is highly interpretable and very strongly used in the clinic for diagnosis and for patient monitoring. So that doesn't mean it's not a very rich source of data, but to recover the 3D function of the electrical activity in the heart is still going to be yeah. Well, we'll go through it now. So the first thing that maybe we can do to try to make this problem a bit more feasible and a bit easier is to think about whether in this ECG we can already separate something. Like, is there anything here that we can separate? And the fact is, actually, we can. So the QRS, which is the first part of the electrocardiogram, represents the activation sequence in the heart, whereas the T wave, which is the second part here, like highlighted in with blue background, is the repolarization sequence in the heart. And these two sequences are governed by different parameters in our mechanistic models, and therefore we should be able to do inference of these parameters separately, which reduces a lot the parameter space and makes the problem much more like computationally efficient to address, let's say, because we are going to be running into computational unfeasibility very quickly with these models, with these problems, as they require on the order of between thousands and maybe hundreds or tens of thousands of simulations to identify, well, to converge and to identify the parameter values when we're doing inference here. So now we need to do the design of the parameter space. And for this, we want to think about two different things. One, we want to think of which parameters are actually going to be identifiable or be changing the ECG in a way that we can then recover them. So this would be from the inference perspective, right? So we want to think, okay, I know I will have ECGs. I won't be able to tell apart parameters that have nothing to do with the ECG, and that given different values for that parameter, I get the same ECG. So then maybe those are parameters that I'm not very interested in. But at the same time, I'm also interested in those parameters if those parameters are going to change how either the therapy works, so the outcome of the therapy, or are going to change how the risk of an arrhythmia or the severity of an arrhythmia. Because those are parts of my context of use and parts of my problem on which I'm going to end up deploying the digital twin on. So even if I cannot tell anything about a parameter that, I don't know, that controls, for example, in the conduction system in the heart, the conduction system in the heart is very small and very thin, and it does not give a strong signature in the electrocardiogram. So there may be properties of that conduction system that I cannot see in the ECG. But if they are relevant for enabling re-entries and circuits for arrhythmias, maybe I want to consider them. Maybe not in the inference itself, because then I'm just throwing computation power out the window, because I cannot identify those parameters. So I'm just going to get a uniform distribution across them, but I'm going to do lots of simulations for nothing. But maybe I can inject them afterwards. So maybe I can do the inference first and identify these parameters, because all the ones I have put here with the references are parameters that you can either define using rule-based methods, or you can infer on, right? But maybe later I can just include some variability, some physiological variability on that parameter, and expand my cohort of digital twins based on that, so that I can represent the variability on that dimension that will be relevant for the test that I will be doing later with the digital twin. Okay. Another thing that we can think about is, instead of injecting variability that would be interesting for the context of use later on, we can think about it also the other way around. So maybe there are parameters in our model, for example, in this case, the actual structure of the fast conduction system in the heart that we cannot observe. So we cannot observe this from the clinical data. It's actually even really challenging to observe this like in ex vivo, because the function of the heart changes like dynamically quite a lot. Like the usage of these trees changes dynamically in a person. So you wouldn't know exactly which was the functionality of the tree of the person alive after they died, even if you were able to extract the tree like histologic, like, you know, as an experiment. So this will be a very hard thing to recover, even by killing the person, which of course we're not going to do. But then we can think about it in another way. So we can think about is, okay, I cannot infer this, but I know at a glance when I get a tree that is non-human or that is very weird, it's very abnormal. And the tree, when you build the tree, it needs to comply with things that I can actually infer. So I can infer from the data, I can infer the white spots here. These white spots are the earliest activation sites, and they do determine a lot the shape of the ECG. So the electrocardiogram will have a different shape depending on which white spots get chosen, and also depending on the time at which these white spots get activated, because these are the earliest activation sites in the ventricles, right? So then I'm going to be inferring these two. I'm going to be inferring the location of these white spots and their times. But of course, given the time and a location of, given a configuration of certain locations and times, I need to be able to build the tree, right? So I need to be able to build the tree afterwards, because that's how it actually works in the heart. There is a tree that connects to these points. It's just that I don't know where the tree is going to go through, but I know how the tree is not going to look like. So I know, so then I can define some sort of like rule-based tree generation algorithm that gives me a set of possible trees to pick from. And this way, instead of injecting more variability in my data, in my digital twins, I'm actually constraining the variability in the digital twins using physiological rules. So I'm saying, okay, the trees that don't look like physiological ones cannot get chosen. Therefore, combinations of locations and times that would lead to an unphysiological tree are also discarded. Right? And this is something that we do. And we do start devising rules with human data, which is what you see in this slide. So these are all human, these are human data, right? But then the human data for the Purkinje and for the electrical conduction system is very scarce, because as we said, even like in with dead people, it's very hard to, with ex vivo heart, it's very hard to extract this information. So then we supplemented with dog data, which are known to have a similar Purkinje, or Purkinje being synonym of ventricular cardiac conduction system structure. Okay, so with that, we can then use some sort of ventricular coordinates to map these parameters, and then they are ready for inference. So now here, this is like the inference algorithm. Well, it's an iterative sampling algorithm that I used, and that is implemented in the GitHubs and in the code that I will share with you later. So we define the parameter space first here, then we simulate like a series of a distribution of these parameters, and we compare them with the clinical data. We get some discrepancy metrics, and then we continue iterating with this, like refining this distribution of parameters, like in an iterative way. In a similar way, after we have done the inference for the activation part of the parameters using the QRS part of the ECG, now we can do the repolarization ones. So the other part, the ones that only affect the T wave. For this, we use linear gradients of action potential duration that have been reported in the literature. Then once we sample these parameters for a specific value of these parameters, we get an action potential duration map. So you can think about it as a cellular relaxation map of the cells in the heart, where you can then plug in action potentials that are aligned in time, so that have the same properties. So this map tells you the relaxation property of a cell in a specific location. And then from here, you build a dictionary with different action potentials based on this property, based on the action potential duration. And then you can just use the dictionary to plug them back in, and then you can calculate the ECG. And then you can do inference with the same algorithm that we were saying before. It's just the diagram looks different, but it's the same thing. Yeah. So here you have the parameters that get chosen. This is the simulation side, and here it gets compared to the clinical data. The clinical data being in black, and then the best match being in green. And what you can see here is all the variability that you're getting from the population, right? And you can see that it's not affecting at all the QRS, so the first part of the signal, which means that the separation of the parameters that we did at the start to simplify the problem actually works well, like in the models that we are using. And we are capable of getting like variability only on part of the electrocardiogram without distorting the other one, allowing us to do the inference of both of parameters like separately from these two parts of the electrocardiogram. So this is the entire pipeline at a glance, right? With the different paper references and my co-authors or my first co-authors and co-authors. Like here, I have some pictures of them at the bottom. And the cool thing about this is that because we use the dictionary of action potentials, that dictionary was built using biophysically detailed action potentials, which means we can already evaluate the drug effects directly on this, even using this iconal fast model. But we need to keep in mind that what we are evaluating is only the effect of the drug on the ECG, because this model is incapable of reproducing arrhythmias as it is. So then we cannot evaluate the safety and efficacy of the drug. We can only see like we can see if the drug is displaying the behavior we would expect on the ECG, but we cannot go beyond that. To go beyond that and actually like complete the study, we will need to translate this to a monodomain model, for each person in the UK biobank that we selected, and then like run the test of the drug there on that large virtual cohort. Cool. So just to wrap up this part of the tutorial, I mean, of course, when we go into digital twins, it brings new ethical and considerations and bias that we need to have when we design them. So we haven't gone through this yet, but it should be part of the tutorial on how to design digital twins, right? So when we do machine learning, it's very obvious to us that we need to be very careful with the distribution of the data, because if the data is biased or if it's only representing a specific ethnic group, like then our conclusions are going to be biased to that, right? So then we need to be very careful on how we design like the data set. When we think about digital twins, specifically in this context of virtual clinical trials, we have these problems because we're using a large data set to build the large virtual cohort, right, for the clinical trials. But we also have another problem, which is that we need to think about also where the mechanistic models that we're going to be using came from. What was the data that was used for those? Because those also come from data, as we said before. And if they are a bit old, and they're like, if these models are like 30 or 40 years old, we can already get a very clear idea of what was the data that was being used for. Like what were the demographics of and ethnic groups of the people that were collaborating in research, and the hospitals that have had access to equipment to build the models at that time and collect those data sets. So we need to be very careful about how we deploy those models, specifically in contexts that are like this one, like virtual clinical trials, which would be used to decide something for lots of people, right? For people from different ethnicities and different like demographics. We need to also like consider whether we need to adjust and maybe recalibrate a little bit the models that we are using for the mechanistic part, right? And I have here just an example, which is that if you don't have the electrode positions for the 12-lead ECG and you place them using rules that are well established, depending on the rib case, like you count ribs and then you know where the electrode goes, That rule works much better in men than in women on average because of the torso shape and the breast shape of women. It does not allow for that placement to be used all the time, right? So then your digital twins, because in my work, I am using these rules. So this means that in my work, I need to be careful because my digital twins for men, if I don't make adjustments for this and I don't include additional variability or something like when it comes to the electrode placement in women, the digital twins of women are going to be less accurate intrinsically because the data simulation has been done more poorly because the electrode location had a higher error on average, right? So just some considerations to have. And just to remark that, of course, we have only seen the top part of this diagram, and we haven't even seen fully like the feeding back into the patient, like closing the loop. So there's still lots of work to be done. Like there's lots of data we still don't know how to incorporate into our digital twins, and that they're incorporated at a statistic probabilistic level in the clinic, for example, like drinking, smoking, stress levels, things that we just don't know how to how to make predictions on at a mechanistic level. And yeah, and just as promised, so here is a link to the code for like running what I just showed you, like the digital twins from ECG and MR. Like you need the meshes, there's no code for meshing. So the meshes, you need to generate the meshes with another code, but there is code for the meshing related to the other paper that I showed previously from Abby. And yeah, you can ask questions about that later. And here I have again the link to the Google Colab, but I have shared it with you through the chat. So yeah, so if you have any questions, I can answer questions now if you want. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Julia. Any question from audience?
I'll stop sharing so I can see things, okay? And then I can share again if needed.
Yeah, sure. So I can see we have many. Yeah, anyone, if you have a question, please just unmute yourself and ask. Or you can like put a message on our chat. I think after this, Julia will present. Yeah, anyone?
Yeah, so it seems that, at least from the beginning of the talk, that choice of the digital twin mode that you used depends on the type of data that you have. Is that an accurate thing to say? So like, is it best not to create a digital twin, like because I'm still struggling with like what constitutes as a good digital twin. So is it that the goal should be creating some kind of virtual organ that has all these different bells and whistles that then you're able to like I guess apply something to, or is it this statistical model that you were presenting, or this mechanistic model? Like how do I choose which level of a digital twin to I guess create for my application? I guess. Sorry, that was a lot of jumble, but I hope that makes sense.
No. Thank you for the question. It is a really good question, and it is not a lot of jumble. So the question you're making is the question I've been trying to answer. So thank you for making it, because it means I haven't been clear enough in the presentation. So it will depend very strongly on, so the digital twin, the correct or good digital twin, depends on what is the question you will need to answer. So the digital twin needs to be able to answer that question, right? And needs to be able to answer that question in the context and in the environment that you want to ask that question in. So it's, when I say that you need to look at which data you have and you need to build the digital twin based on that data, what I'm not repeating anymore is this data sufficient to answer the question? Like, am I still like on track to answering the initial question? I'm assuming like maybe I was too quick, but it's always like you always need to, like in that hierarchy of, and that's why I ordered like the steps in that way. So because you always need to be looking back up and make sure that you're still complying with everything you've gone through in the step that you are in now. So like first step is, what is the question? What is the context? Where am I going to be deploying this, right? What are the needs like that I need to fulfill? Then if my data is not going to be able to represent those needs well, then I'm done. You know, if, for example, I want to represent variability in the human population and I have a 20 people data set, then we're done. And if that 20 people data set, if it's not even human data, if it's like, I don't know, pig data, then it's game over for the digital twin at that stage already.
Yeah. So then what's that in that's the best, I guess, for determining whether it works for your digital twin? Or is there a specific in? I mean, I don't.
When you say in, you mean
Like the number of data sets, for example.
I don't think there is even like a rule of thumb on that. It's so problem specific. So if you have a problem in which you know that the variability is very low, so that you know people will, in that specific thing, people are very alike to each other.
Yeah.
Then you don't need that much data, because right? Because then you can, or maybe you have a small group, you have a small data set, but of a really, really specific thing, and you know that there is not that much data to be gathered there anyways, because it's a very rare thing. So then you just need to cope with that. So it depends very strongly on the problem itself. If there is a lot of variability and you have very little data, and your data does not cover well the demographics in reality, then you can't do it.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Great presentation. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Any further question before Julia move to the coding presentation?
Hi, Dr. Kim. Thank you very much for the great presentation. I have a very basic question. I try to understand what is the difference between a data-driven model and the digital twin, because it seems like lots of data-driven model, they can like assimilate the data for real time, like the Navier-Stokes equation example you gave us. Sometimes people use it to assimilate some initial condition based on different time stage. Can that be considered as the digital twin? I'm trying to realize the difference between data-driven and the digital twin. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that is another really good question. So digital twin is a term that is now being used a lot. So it's become very popular and very catchy very quickly. And some people will say, and I think they are in their right to say it, and I do agree partially with what they say, that we are abusing a bit of the term of digital twin, right? So because what we were calling a personalized model like 5 years ago, now it's a digital twin, and we have rebranded it as if it was something different. So you're right. So the traditional personalized modeling, like in many cases, they will be able to call it a digital twin. And I think it depends a lot. And that's why I had that slide at the beginning of that there are lots of definitions of a digital twin right now, like going on. From what I have heard in the community, they are happy to settle that the work that I presented that I do, they are happy to call it a digital twin snapshot. Because they say, okay, this is a digital twin right now, but it won't be a digital twin tomorrow anymore. Because but then at the same time, I say, okay, but if tomorrow you do another reading and you give me another ECG, I can rerun this with a prior on the previous inference. So I can just like continuously like shrink more, because I get a distribution of parameter values. So I can continue shrinking it and like adjusting it. And the more data you give me, in theory, the more accurate I get with time, right? Like with more iterations. So, and this is something that I can already do with this model. The reason why I don't do it is because I don't have longitudinal data. Right? So it has the digital twin capability, but the way it's being presented, we can agree digital twin snapshot. And I think that maybe another difference between traditional just personalization is that I think if you're going to call something a digital twin, one of the definitions I personally agree with is that it needs to be a tool for something, because otherwise it's too broad. So a digital twin cannot be a personalized model and that's it. It needs to be to answer a specific question and for a specific problem, right?
Yes. Thank you very much.
But you're right. You're right. It is confusing, and I think, yeah, it's very similar to personalized modeling.
Yeah, thank you very much. If I may I ask another question?
Yeah.
So my background is I'm from radiation oncology department. So we do a lot of radiotherapy, and then I'm very interesting in the application of digital twin because it looks very promising for potential like a precision treatment for each individual patient. However, we wonder like to what degree of model fidelity is sufficient to claim that we are applying digital twin. Things like human body is like a very complicated interaction, and for our application, we use the external radiation to treat the tumor. It looks like need to consider a lot of interaction between different organ and tissues. So would you please like give us some suggestion? Like if we are interested in this direction, what would be the a good start to doing this related work? Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome. So it depends. It depends on how you so the digital twin, right? For the application that you're saying, it can be done at, as you say, at different levels of fidelity or at different levels of complexity with different amount of representation of human physiology and mechanisms. And that will depend on what is it will depend on what is the question you're asking, but also like what is the data that you have to build the model that you're going to be using, right? So if you do want to know, if your question is how is the best way to deliver this therapy in this patient, you want to make a decision on therapy the delivery, right? Like maybe with a specific with a digital twin that has a specific accuracy, maybe you will get like an area where you can deliver and a range with uncertainty on the strength of the therapy that you can use. Maybe with a more precise digital twin, you will get like a more granular, a more like precise prediction. But at the end, it's not that one is intrinsically better than the other. Like it is, as long as it helps in narrowing down the decision from uninformed to inform to some extent, I think it's already like a leap forward in terms of like the deployment of digital twins, because the most valuable resource at the end is time. So if the digital twin is going to save time and it's going to like fulfill a need in the clinic for like therapy planning, I think it's already like a valuable contribution. Like I don't think you need to go all the way, on the first step. I think it can be like more of an incremental thing. And the first digital twin actually does not, like digital twins don't need to be mechanistic. They can be statistical based. So if you have lots of data on, depending on the characteristics, like, anatomical characteristics of the tumor, like how to deliver, like what is the success rate of delivering one way or another the radiation, then you can use that. You don't need to go like for a multi-scale model, like maybe it's not necessary.
Thank you very much for a great suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome.
I have a question, then I ask. So I understand that the purpose of digital twin is to understand the behavior of a system in unseen circumstances, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. let's,
Okay.
yes.
So I can understand that digital twins of man-made machines like Apollo 13 or a car or other things. This is one thing because these machines behave deterministically. They follow some mathematical equations. But the biological systems, they are not causal systems. They are not deterministic systems. They might behave differently. I mean, two hearts might behave differently under same stimuli in two different people. So how do we incorporate this randomness in biological processes and biological systems in digital twins?
Well, that is an aspect of model complexity, the fact that there is stochasticity in the way that the heart behaves, and you can incorporate it in different ways. But the important thing is to think whether it is crucial to incorporate, because it's not a straightforward characteristic to be incorporating, right? Because the most models of the heart, at least the ones that are being mostly taken up for electrophysiology, are deterministic. So building stochastic models is something that you can do and people do, but it increases a lot the complexity and the computational cost of a model, and it needs to be supported by a strong reason, in my opinion. So if it's going, like it is a tough one, because you're right, there is stochasticity and we should be incorporating this, but we are also constrained by computational resources at the moment. So it depends on if this stochasticity is absolutely fundamental on investigating the thing you want to look at, then it has to go in. If it's not, then maybe not. And it also depends at which scale the stochasticity is, at which level, and how much it will affect the outcome, and whether maybe you can have some sort of, maybe the model won't be stochastic, but maybe if you test similar conditions in a deterministic model that is sensitive to changes, maybe you get a bit of the randomness effect that you're looking for as well, right? So changing initial conditions or something like that. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, but I agree with you that it's a limit. If you don't use a stochastic model, you are limiting yourself in terms of you have a modeling error, right? Of the physiology.
Thank you, Julia. Any further question? If no, maybe you can start to give us a hand-on experience how to do the digital twin.
I mean, only if you're interested, because I have shared the collab, so it is very straightforward. I'll share my screen and go through it quickly, but I will.
Yeah, maybe
I will skim through. Okay.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Okay. So this is the Google Colab that I have shared. Okay. As I said in the message in the chat, this is not going to actually run it's not going to generate digital twins or digital twin snapshots or personalization. You can call it in different ways. These are equivalent terms in this context, right? Because we are not actually solving a problem. So maybe you don't want to call them digital twins. It can just be personalization, right? But it's not going to be doing this, because that is a very, it's a computationally intensive process. And this runs on Google Colab, and they give you so the nice thing about this is that if you open the link, you can click, I think around here, there is a button that says copy to my drive. And then you will have a copy of the Colab, and it's self-contained, and it runs directly on Google servers. So you don't need to install anything. So the first box here does the installation of the Python packages that you need to run, like the notebook. Then it needs to restart the process to load these packages. Here it downloads it downloads my GitHub, but it doesn't download it into your computer. It downloads it into the Google Colab itself, that it has its own memory. right? And then now it starts loading all the different packages and doing the pre-computations for running some simulations of cardiac electrical function, right? So this there will be some processes here that take a while. So don't if you do try it and it takes like between 6 and 8 minutes in some of these steps, don't worry. It's because it's doing a lot of pre-computations, and it can only use one thread, and the computer is very weak that Google gives you. It would run faster if you were to install it in an actual machine, and it would have access to more than one thread at a time. It would be much faster. Okay, then once it has prepared everything, right? And it has created all the, it has defined all the classes and all the objects that it needs. Here is just like a small snippet of code that I have added so that it can do visualizations of in 3D. This snippet of code is not, I have to define it here because you won't find it inside my GitHub, because the GitHub that I have shown you, which is, it's in my personal GitHub, but yeah, I mean, you won't be able to see it because now I'm sharing, am I sharing this screen or am I sharing? I don't think you can see it now if I change, and I change to something else. Now you won't. Doesn't matter. I can type it here. I'll type it later into the chat. That will be best. I'll type later into the chat where the address of my GitHub.
Sure.
Yeah, there you won't have this because this is not useful for doing the inference. So then it's not a function that you need because it's for visualizing. And if you're going to be running 100,000 simulations, you don't want to be seeing all of them in 3D. Right? So that's why this code is here. And then here it just defines the parameters of a simulation, and it runs a simulation, and this is the result, right? And it should be quite fast. It should take only a few seconds to do any one simulation. And this is the times at which the different nodes in the heart get activated, right? So this is just showing time in milliseconds, and you can. Sorry, I cannot rotate it in the right way. It's inverted, but it doesn't matter. So you can see here the sites of that it activates first. So the early activation sites, they have like a darker color. You can see them there. And this is a quite physiological activation. And you can see that here. I mean, it's not perfect, but it is within range of what we would consider physiologically. What I mean when I say it's physiological, I don't mean that the ECG looks physiological, which it really doesn't in some of the leads. But what I mean is that the parameters that I have chosen are physiological from the literature, right? So these are parameters that have been reported for people. And this, if anything, it comes to show that while some of the signals do look okay and do look physiological, others don't, showing that there is a real need here for like doing personalization and doing inference. Because if you just pick at random, like some parameter values that are reported in the literature, you do not get a good ECG match with a clinical one from this patient just because of the geometry. Because the geometry is another big determinant of the electrocardiogram, of course, but it's not the only one. And in this, yeah, and it doesn't dominate as much as you would think. So here, I just have a few more examples in which I play around with parameter values. So here I'm just changing the speeds of the activation. You can see here that the values are completely off range. These are still milliseconds, but it's just to highlight the points that I was telling you that it's activating, that are activating first, which you cannot see before. You can see them more clearly here. So it's just to play a little bit with it. And then you can see that because the parameter values are completely rubbish, like the ECG is rubbish as well. And then I think I have a couple of left of bundle branch blocks examples. One left bundle branch block and another one right bundle branch block. This one's still with the wrong values for the conductions speeds, but you can clearly see that one side activates earlier than the other. And then now with the conduction speeds fixed, it's more subtle, but you can still see that one side activates earlier than the other. and you can see the ECGs as well. And then with the other side, so now, right now it's time for the right bundle branch block. So this is the one. And then I think I have here a script to just visualize all of these examples that I just showed you in the same plot. Right, so that you can see how you have the healthy, so the clinical ECG of this subject, and then you have the other the different simulations of different conditions. The simulation of healthy, left bundle branch block, and that right bundle branch block, and that's it. And this last one is, I think it's the same as the first one. It's just in case you want to tweak the parameters without changing the other ones. I have already created the cell. That's it. Yeah, I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you so much for Julia. Thank you so much for the very comprehensive and also well-structured presentation, and also taking time to prepare this code lab for presentation. We could take only a few more questions if anyone have. Any further question to ask about the If no, maybe we can stop here if we do not have further question. Thank you again for the brilliant presentation, and thank you for joining this tutorial. Thank you, Julia. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Lei. It was
very nice presentation. Thank you.
And thank you everyone for the questions. It was very good. Well.
Okay, thank you everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.